Welcome to another episode of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you, here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. Thanks for tuning in. If you have any questions or comments, send them to comment@am950radio.com. So, last week I didn't do the typical journey through the Constitution that I've been doing here for a while, so we're going to get back to that this week by doing the 11th Amendment. That's where we left off here. So remember that the first 10 amendments that we covered before, those are the Bill of Rights. So those were the ones that Congress passed. The first Congress proposed them, right away, basically, when they started working under the Constitution. And then the states, enough states ratified them. So this 11th Amendment was ratified in 1795. So it had, the Constitution had been in play for a few years here, and this is, I believe, the third Congress was the one that proposed this particular amendment. So this is the first one where the Founding Fathers, those that are still around, but probably the next generation a little bit too, they responded. This 11th Amendment is in response to a Supreme Court decision they did not like. So in 1793, the Supreme Court decided a case called Chisholm versus Georgia. So Georgia is the state of Georgia. In Chisholm, he was a resident of South Carolina, and he was suing the state of Georgia for a debt that he claimed that Georgia owed him as a result of the Revolutionary War and some stuff that happened after that. So he sued the state of Georgia. He sued him in federal court as opposed to state court. So Georgia was saying, hey, you got to sue us in state court. We're a state. We have some sovereign immunity. You can't sue us in federal court. So Georgia didn't even bother to really have anything to do with the case. So Chisholm ended up winning, basically. And then Georgia appealed it to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court in 1793 then ruled that, states could be sued by citizens of another state in federal court. Now, remember, we're talking about suing in federal court here. You can sue states in state court. That's not an issue. But the case here involves an individual from another state, so in this case, South Carolina, suing the state of Georgia in federal court. So this involves an interpretation of Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution, which is a part of the judicial branch, right? And one of the things we talked about is the diversity jurisdiction of the federal courts. And the original Constitution said that federal courts have jurisdiction to hear cases between a state and a citizen of another state, which is what this particular case was. So the Supreme Court basically read the, plain words in the Constitution and said, oh, it looks to us like this is okay. And the Founding Fathers didn't like that decision. And, Congress didn't like it either. The states didn't like it because there were a bunch of other cases going on at the same time where individuals had sued states in federal court using the same diversity jurisdiction part. So Congress proposed the amendment in 1794. And so this is an example of Congress using their checks and balances, basically, on the Supreme Court by proposing a constitutional amendment, basically in response to the Supreme Court decision, and they wanted to change the Constitution, which it ultimately did. So here's the amendment. This is what it says. Not a very long one. So it says the judicial power of the United States. Now, by the United States, they're talking about federal courts here. The judicial power of the United States shall not be construed to extend to any suit in law or equity commenced or prosecuted against one of the United States by citizens of another state or by citizens or subjects of any foreign state. And by foreign state, they're basically meaning foreign country. So that's the amendment. So basically what the amendment says is it changed that Supreme Court decision where it says in there, no, you can't. A citizen of one state can't sue a different state in federal court. Now, you can still sue them in state court. that's not a problem. But you can't do it in federal court. Plus, it also added in there the part of citizens or subjects of a foreign country can't sue a state in state or in federal court either. You got to go to state court. So this amendment is basically kind of one of those states' rights type of things that a lot of the founders were in favor of. They didn't want the federal government to have too much power at this particular time in history. So this is a time where they pulled back a little bit on the powers of the federal court. So the intent of this amendment is to force these diversity cases into state court. So this is the first amendment that actually changed what the Constitution said. So the effect of the amendment is to keep some cases in state court rather than going to federal court. Now, there's been some exceptions to this, though, where the 14th Amendment is a particular one. I'll get to the 14th Amendment here. But basically, when you look at the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, at the end of them, they all say that Congress has the power to enforce these amendments. It doesn't say states. Of course, part of the problem back then is the states weren't doing anything to help the black people, so, it's the federal government. So there are times where cases that are brought under the 14th Amendment where Congress specifically says that those cases can go to federal court. Then, at least the Supreme Court has said, yeah, you can do that. So, other than, those types of specific cases, the 11th Amendment basically says a citizen from one state can't sue a different state in federal court anymore. You got to go to the state courts instead, which has a little bit of an advantage for the states. So that's the 11th Amendment. Next week, I'm going to try to do the 12th Amendment, unless there's all kinds of other news to do. But the 12th Amendment is about the Electoral College, so that's going to be a little bit of a longer segment probably. So that's it for the 11th Amendment. So now I'm going to move on for the rest of this segment to, I read a letter to the editor recently in the Star Tribune. And I've been reading, similar type things there and similar type things in the comment section that they have on their, online on their websites and similar type things all over on, on the internet. So finally it's like, okay, I got to say something about this. So here we go. So the guy starts out saying, and you see this all the time, like, I voted for Biden in 2020, but I had to vote for Trump in 2024. And then, so here's the quote, specific quote from his letter. Because I believe the Democrats' policies are ruining our country. Close quote. Of course, he doesn't say, what policies are ruining the country. He says, well, I'm saving that for a larger discussion. How convenient. So he doesn't give any policies or why it's ruining the country. And then he goes on to say, quote, I am tired of reading all the potential negative consequences of Trump's policies, close quote. So again, I question whether he voted for Biden in 2020, but I'll get back to that anyway. But so then he complains that the paper hasn't written a, quote, here are the likely positive outcomes, close quote, type of articles for Trump's policies. He yearns for the days of old where the paper, quote, presents both sides, close quote, of the news, and claims that the paper is catering to liberals. Not that one, I've had previous shows about how, the news media is not liberals, not catering to liberals. Republicans own the media, and they cater to the Republicans nowadays. I'll get back to that here, too. But, so he wants to read more about, the positive things about, and he brings up three things: tariffs, closing the border, and getting rid of DEI. Now, he doesn't say getting rid of DEI, but when you read the description of it, that's what he's talking about. So what I'm going to do now is try to clear this up for him. Okay, so first of all, did you really vote for Biden in 2020? Okay, what policies of the Democrats are ruining the country, because Biden pretty much did what Biden said he was going to do, and a few other things too. But what exactly are these policies that are quote ruining our country, close quote, according to you? Now this sounds like the old Republican talking points about saying a lot of things with no evidence, saying a lot of conclusions. But let's assume, let's take the guy at his word here. Okay. Let's assume that some of these policies are ruining the country, so he had to vote for Trump. Okay, so here is why there should be very little coverage of the, quote, likely positive outcomes, close quote, of Trump's policies. Real simple. There aren't any. Now, at least for you and I, but there are some. So here, I'm going to give you some positive outcomes. There are positive outcomes if you are a rich person. That's it. I've cleared it up for you. If you look at the policies, and I'm going to talk about this budget that the Republicans just passed last night to show you this as well. There aren't any positive outcomes unless you're a rich person to Trump's policies. There. Let's look at tariffs. You want to talk about tariffs? Fine. Let's look at tariffs. 16 different Nobel Prize winners in economics have come out and said that tariffs, if they're imposed, are going to raise inflation. Okay, Trump imposed some of those tariffs. Guess what? Inflation is now going up. How's those price of eggs now? What likely positives are out there when inflation goes up? The rich get richer, as I said before. That's the positive outcome. If you're rich, you're going to get richer. Consumer confidence. They just did a consumer confidence survey. This is something the government does to get consumer input on how what they're thinking about the economy. They just did one the other day. The results, that has dropped to the lowest that it's been in 4 years. So apparently the consumers aren't looking at any positive consequences of these tariffs either. They know what's coming. I mean, it's really simple. Tariffs are a tax, as I mentioned before. They get passed on to us. We're going to be paying higher prices, not just for eggs, but for all kinds of other things. So this person that wants to hear positive outcomes about tariffs, well, is your grocery bill going down? Trump keeps saying, well, I'm going to lower those on the very first day. No, they're going up. And now he's basically been saying, hey, that's Biden's problem. That ain't mine. So, guess what else is causing some current inflation? Well, how about deporting all those immigrant workers? You want to talk about closing the border? Well, there's literally food rotting in the fields, rotting on the vines, rotting on the trees. Wherever they're growing, waiting to be harvested. There's a lot less supply now. Basic economics, less supply, the price is going up. This is one reason why your food prices are going up. Pretty simple here. Okay, I can hear it already. The Bruce, come on now, deporting these people will be a good thing. Some Americans can take these jobs instead. Well, okay, yeah, maybe there will be a few. But if you actually go look at the data, Americans don't want these jobs. If they did, they would have applied for them before the immigrants took them. Why do you think immigrants are taking all these jobs? Americans are not flocking to apply for these jobs. Even the ones that have, the people that have been deported now, they're not standing in line all day long to apply for these jobs. Let's not forget that all that additional cost going to deport these millions of people, at least that's what Trump says he's going to do, right? Where's this money going to magically appear? They're going to have to borrow it, which is going to raise the national debt, and it's going to raise our interest payments. Nothing positive here, dude. Then you want to talk about DEI. Well, so we'll talk about St. Thomas. You just read in the paper that St. Thomas is going to lose a lot of scholarship money because, there's They're trying to get diverse students, helping them become teachers. We can't have that under the Trump administration, so they pulled funding for that stuff. How many white kids are going to lose scholarships because of that? It's not just all minority students. No, maybe St. Thomas will, take some of their own money and continue funding these, but if they don't, it's going to hurt the white people too. Does that sound like a positive? So the last thing I want to talk about here is, he claims in there, you got to tell both sides. I want to hear both sides of all these issues. I've said it before, I'm going to keep saying it. Implicit in this both sides argument are that both of them are correct. Both of them have some truth to it. Oftentimes that's not the case. We all know politicians lie. This has been studied. This has been tested by political scientists and other scientists. And yeah, I know you don't like scientists, but studies have shown that the Republicans lie a lot more than the Democrats do. Now, Democrats, you got to call them out too for when they lie. I mean, they do it. But definitely the Republicans are doing it a lot more. And you just have to, listen to Trump. Every other word that comes out of his mouth is a lie. Every other word Mike Johnson says in the House of Representatives is a lie. I mean, did you listen to what he said about this great budget proposal they just passed? I mean, my God. It doesn't take a lot of research to figure out what he said is a lie. There's only one side to the truth, not two sides. Now, there are certainly issues where Democrats and Republicans have legitimate policy debates, but oftentimes Republicans simply lie about it. This is why I call it Fox News. I call it Fox Lies, because that's all they do about it. They just lie. The whole right-wing media sphere lies. They put all this stuff out there so that, everybody consumes it and they don't correct it. Or if they do, it's on like page 95 of a story, buried in the bottom someplace. They built up this network. They basically, whatever they throw out there to get your attention is what people start believing. This is how propaganda works. It's up to us to learn what the truth is. This is where far too many people, particularly when it comes to politics, have stopped trying to learn the truth or do their own research or do their own critical thinking about exactly what's going on. They just believe all this crap that the politicians tell them. Or the, cable shows tell them, or people on Facebook tell them. And look what that's gotten us today. We are, on the brink of fascism here. So, no, there aren't any likely positive outcomes to Trump policies. Again, unless you're rich, you're going to get more money. I'll talk about that in one of the future segments here. So as we go to break, I'm going to come back, and I'm actually going to, talk a little bit more about the media. I've skipped talking about them for a little bit, but got to talk about that. So we'll talk about that on the other side of the break. Welcome back to the second segment of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you. Here on AM 950, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota, I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. So, it's been a while since I've taken a shot at the media. I mean, I love doing that. If you listen to some of my earlier episodes, I usually do a segment on that. Well, I'm going to start talking about the media again today. So that streak ends. But what I'm going to talk about is like this is an opportunity now. What I'm going to be talking about here for the press to redeem themselves. Let's see if they actually do it. So what I'm talking about is that the White House, which is basically Trump, right, directing these things, is now stripping the White House Correspondents Association of its role in managing the White House press pool. That they select the people that go out with there's a rotating group of journalists and photographs who go out with the president when he goes, somewhere on Air Force One or, goes on a trip someplace in the United States or, other places where the whole, press pool doesn't go. You just have part of it. And the White House Correspondents Association has been the one that picks the journalists and the photographers who go out on this. Well, now, the White House is going to decide who gets to go out with the president. And presumably vice president, maybe, and some other people in the cabinet. But Press Secretary Carolyn Leavitt said that, quote, a select group of D.C.-based journalists should no longer have a monopoly over the privilege of press access at the White House, close quote. So basically what this means now is that the government itself is choosing the journalists who are going to cover Trump. What could go wrong? So much for freedom of the press, right? Now they're going to just pick their own press corps. This is what Russia does. No. Now I get it. We all know how Trump loves Putin, so he's just mimicking Putin here again with getting, his favorite so-called journalists are going to they're the only ones that are going to cover him when he goes anyplace now. What could go wrong here? Right? He wants to look like Putin, so he's going to get the softball questions. He's not going to get any critical questions. He's just going to say whatever the heck he wants to say and be portrayed like, the wannabe king that he wants to be. So this takes more power away from the people and gives Trump more power. Not coincidentally, this decision comes shortly after the Associated Press, or AP, sued the Trump administration for kicking them out of the White House press corps because they didn't want to say Gulf of America. Trump wants everybody to say Gulf of America, not Gulf of Mexico, and the Associated Press said, "No, we're going to keep calling it Gulf of Mexico," and they booted him. But now they're in court about this. The AP sued him. There's going to be a hearing in March about that. So the question here is, well, how is the legacy media going to respond to this now that Trump is going to be able to pick who goes out with him? When he's not in the White House, who goes out and and is able to ask these questions and take his pictures and all this stuff. Will the legacy media or mainstream media, if you want to call them that, will they submit? Will they just go along with what the Trump administration just did? Or are they going to fight this somehow? Will they take legal action, for example, saying this violates freedom of speech and, at least for them, freedom of the press? Because the press ain't going to be free when the government is the one picking them. So I really hope that the press fights this rather than just submitting to it, submitting to the fascists there in the White House. This is the press's chance to stand up for itself. And hopefully start covering Trump more critically and criticizing him even more on a daily basis, because it's so easy to do that. Trump is simply trying to get the press to submit to him, or obeying in advance, which is one of the tools of tyranny. And how authoritarians, dictators, fascists, kings, whatever you want to call them, come into power and stay in power. They get the press. They get rid of the negative press, and then they replace it with the positive press. This particular press is screwed up covering Trump ever since 2015, which enabled him to win the first election and enabled him to get back into power in the last election here. Now is a chance for the press to redeem themselves. Or submit to, the leader and dutifully go along and report the propaganda that Trump wants out there in public. The press better not fall for this okey doke again. So let me offer some free advice to the press here. Sue them in court for, violating freedom of speech, violating freedom of the press. And then don't cover them. Don't go to or don't even try to go on these, when he leaves the White House. Don't even cover him when he's in the White House as well. Just don't cover him. Stop going along with this. Stop going along with doing what he wants you to do. Resist. Start criticizing him, please. Now, I know your bosses are Republicans, and I know your bosses give money to Trump. They gave him millions for his inauguration, right? They gave him millions for his campaign. But don't submit. Now, why am I saying this? But don't bother covering him. Well, we all know how much of an ego he has. If you don't do what he wants, if you don't cover him like he wants, his ego is going to go crazy. And we all know what happens when he goes crazy. He starts opening up his mouth, starts saying even crazier stuff. And you can use that in your court cases. So the existing case that the AP has, you can use it there. You can also use it in your own lawsuits. Hopefully you do sue him. Because what he says, you can use it in court. And that'll help your case. Now, if you start taking more shots at him, covering him more critically, start turning up the pressure on him and his administration even more, without playing his games, you may benefit from this. Well, besides standing up for yourselves, which, show a spine and do it already. But here's the other advantage to doing this. You may get more people actually watching your shows or reading your paper or whatever it is that you're putting out. Right now, many people are turned off by the press for their kowtowing to Trump over the years. The so-called liberal network, right, MSNBC, or even CNN, which, again, I've said on previous shows, I don't think they're liberal networks, but let's just assume that they are. Okay, MSNBC recently fired a bunch of employees, both hosts of shows and those who are behind the cameras, the producers and the executive producers and the cameramen and all that sort of stuff, right, the behind-the-scenes people. And for these behind-the-scenes people, they fired them, but then they said, "Oh, well, you can reapply for these, these similar jobs." Well, just as an aside here, if you look at the people, the on-air people that they fired, a lot of them are minority hosts. What does that tell you? But that's a whole other issue. But I throw that out there anyway. They're saying, well, we had to do this because our ratings are going down. Well, why are your ratings going down? Gee, I wonder what happened here. Why are our ratings going down? I'll give you some hints if you haven't quite figured it out yet. Many liberals, many people who call themselves liberals, many progressive Democrats are dumping you because of all your sane-washing of Trump. So they're taking their First Amendment rights of freedom of speech, and going to the social media, going to the internet, watching more online news sources instead of watching your shows. We're sick and tired of your coverage of Trump. We're sick and tired of your coverage of Republicans. As I mentioned before, progressives, you need to start building your own media empire to counter Fox lies, and the other right-wing outlets, and also to counter lamestream media. Okay, I have a feeling they're still going to keep doing this stuff. But one thing to point out here is Midas Touch, which is a podcast that is criticizing Trump multiple times a day on what they put out in content, criticizes Republicans. Guess what? They're now the number one downloaded podcast. They have now beat out Joe Rogan. MSNBC, what does that tell you? You should start covering and criticizing Trump and the Republicans more, you're going to get more people back. Now, one thing you didn't do, which you should have done, is got rid of Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski on Morning Joe. I knew you wouldn't. But, their numbers have tanked. Nobody's watching them anymore. As a result of that, when they went down to Mar-a-Lago and, bent the knee to Trump, a lot of people quit watching MSNBC. And they're still not. So, members of the press, why don't you start covering Democrats more? And particularly the progressives more. Mainstream media doesn't like to cover progressives. They just aren't getting enough attention. I mean, Bernie Sanders is out there doing all kinds of stuff now. And the media isn't covering him much. What you're seeing online is, people who are actually there recording it, putting it out there. You're not seeing NBC going to a Bernie Sanders rally in Iowa City. Why not? Your ratings are going to go up if you start doing this. And again, don't just stop with Trump. You got to do it for Republicans as well. So start doing it now after, in my next segment, I'm going to talk about this budget proposal that they passed. But if you write every day about how the Republican budget in the House is going to, cut Medicare, even though Trump said earlier he wasn't going to touch it, well, surprise, he lied again. And the press likes to do this. It's like, they'll put out a story for a day or two, and then say, well, and then you won't hear anything about it after that. It's like, why don't you keep covering it? You put it out there a day or two just to cover your ass and say, well, we wrote a story. Well, keep writing it because they're not doing anything about it. So, are you going to go out, Star Tribune? Are you going to go out and stick a microphone in front of the 4 Republican representatives who voted for this proposal? Are you going to actually do that? And actually, let's assume that you are. Let's assume you stick a microphone in front of them and you ask them a question. Are you going to wait till they actually answer your question? Or are you going to just let them do their word salads, party line spiel about avoiding answering the question, and then you just say, well, I asked them the question. And you just let them dodge, answering it. I have a feeling that's what you're going to see in the Star Tribune and many other places. Is they can say, well, we asked them, but they're not going to answer it. You still haven't gotten a direct answer from Pete Stauber about what he thinks about Trump pardoning the J6 insurrectionists. No, I did see a little thing where somebody did ask him, but he didn't answer the question. And then that's all they reported. Keep on them. But, they're not going to do it. Do some fact-checking on all these Republican claims and all this stuff Mikey J says. Like he's saying this morning and stuff he was saying last night. Instead of just printing what they say. I mean, I'm really sick and tired of reading in the press. This is what Mike Johnson said. And then that's all you do. Getting back to what I said earlier about the letter to the editor. If the politicians lie to you, which they will, how about you don't print it? And tell the public that the answer they gave to you was a lie, so you're not going to print it. Why don't you do that? Why don't you try that? I think you might get more people reading and watching your stuff if you're really honest with the people. Why don't you ask Republicans about, hey, where's all this proof about waste, fraud, and abuse? Why are you firing all these federal workers? Why don't you do some stories on the ramifications of these firings? Yeah, there's going to be a lot of people who are going to be unemployed. They're going to go on unemployment. That's going to cost us more money. But in the end, people are going to lose services. Why don't you do stories about that? Now, are you going to go to Pete Stauber or Michelle Fischbach Or the other two and say, hey, because I read in the Star Tribune where 6 Republicans in the Minnesota legislature said, hey, don't do these Medicare cuts or Medicaid cuts. You 4 voted for it anyway. So, how about Star Tribune? You go out there and ask them about this. Their constituents in the state, or the people in the Minnesota legislature who represent some of their constituents, have told you not to do this. They're not, they don't want you to do this, but you did it anyway. So please, you in the media, if you start covering and criticizing the administration more, I think you will find out that you're going to get more ratings and you're going to get more readership. So if that's your real goal here, to get more people to watch your stuff and read your stuff, why don't you try telling the truth about what's going on with the Trump administration? The only likely positive outcome is the rich people are going to get richer. Why don't you start doing articles about that? Well, we'll see what they do here. All right, when we come back for the third segment, I'm going to talk about this budget bill the Republicans voted or just passed last night. So we'll see you on the other side.
Those crazy nights I do remember in my youth.
Welcome back to the third and final segment on today's show of Politics Matters, how civics, politics, and law affect you. Here on AM 50, the Progressive Voice of Minnesota. I'm your host, Bruce Klopfleisch. All right, if you've been paying attention to politics, so last night, that would be Tuesday night, I'm recording this on Wednesday morning, the Republicans passed a budget resolution. So this is like the first step to pass their ultimate budget, and it has to get through the Senate by reconciliation. I'll talk later about that, but they got to go through a bunch of different steps. Well, they went through the first one last night, and they passed it where they had basically it passed by 2 votes. So if 2 Republicans had changed their votes, it would have been a tie, and it would have lost. Now, I want to talk to rural voters here. This is what this last section is about here. You have to wonder why rural voters keep voting for Republicans over and over and over again when Republican policies are killing their small towns. Now, I have a feeling it's, the taxes are so high. I'll talk about that in this segment. But, I want to keep my guns and, some of these culture war, issues might, they'll probably be playing in here. But if you look at the economics, if this bill passes, you're going to get screwed in the rural areas. So, out in rural Minnesota, 70%, 75% of the people vote for Republicans in a lot of these, districts. Like, why? Why are you doing that? So here's some of the consequences now for doing this. Let's look at this proposed tax cut. Guess who's going to pay less taxes? The top 5%. Not the top 20, not the top 10, but the top 5%. The rest of us, 95%, are going to get a tax increase. I'll say that again. The rest 95% of us are going to pay a tax increase, according to a study done by the Institute of Taxation and Economic Policy. So, as an example, if you are making $55,000 a year, your taxes are going to go up by $1,530. You got that sitting around? Particularly out in rural Minnesota, you got $1,500 sitting around you can chip in to pay for a tax cut for the rich people. So this top 5%, we're talking about people who make over $360,000 a year in income. The average income for the first 4% of that group, and that group is, the money is from $360,000 to $915,000. So the average person in that group, in that 4%, is going to get a savings of $7,160. So your $1,500 is going to, help pay for the tax cut to these people. And by the way, it looks like they're getting more revenue than you're putting in. How's that going to work? This is why when you see tax cuts, a light should go off in your head going, deficit's going to go up. That's what happens here. But for the top 1%, so these are the people that make over $915,000, their savings is going to be $36,320. That's what this whole crappy bill that Republicans are going to pass, this is all what it's for. So you, the poor people, and the rest of us in the 95% get to pay for a tax cut for a rich person. The top 1%, they're getting a $1.5 trillion, I'll say that again, 1.5 trillion with a T, tax cut if this proposal goes. Since people in rural areas tend to make, overall less money, they get to pay more in taxes. How do you feel about that? This is nothing new. This is what Republicans have been doing to you for years out in the rural areas. So the budget resolution that passed last night contained roughly an $880 million cut to the Medicaid program, which provides health insurance for low-income families and for kids, and for people, old people like your grandma or your grandpa who are in nursing homes. They spent all their money already. They're being covered by Medicaid. That program is going to take huge cuts, $880 million. So in Minnesota, this means cuts to the Minnesota Care Program, which is our version of low-income people getting, that money is paid for by Medicaid funding money. There's a lot of rural people on this program. Get ready to pay more for health insurance. Get ready to pay for more of your own medical bills. Get ready to take grandma out of the nursing home and bring her home. I'll get to that here in a second. Furthermore, less of that money means hospitals don't get their money either. They're not going to get reimbursed through this program. Some of those rural hospitals are going to close. A lot of them already have, but more of them are going to close, causing more harm in rural, America and in rural Minnesota. Medicaid covers 1 in 5 people in the United States, including 63% in the nursing homes. Where are all these people going to go when these nursing homes who aren't going to get paid as much, they're going to close? And when these hospitals close, where are they going to go? Are you going to bring your mom home and take care of her? How are you going to get the extra money to do that? So, what about Obamacare in the rural areas? Well, part of the Obamacare included the Medicaid expansion. Right, where right now, the federal government reimburses the states 90% of that cost. What the press isn't hardly telling you is that this proposal that just passed cuts that number from 90% down to 57%. So now hospitals in rural areas, nursing homes in rural areas, they're going to get less money now. They're not going to get 90%. They're going to get 57%. That's a big chunk. Guess what's going to happen? They're going to close. You can't blame Democrats for this. Well, what about farmers? Let's talk about farmers in rural areas, right? That's who makes up a lot of the small towns, a lot of the rural areas are farmers. This bill calls for a cut of $230 billion from agriculture. The House Agriculture Committee is supposed to find, where they're going to come up with this $230 billion. Cuts are going to come from family farms and the SNAP program. Well, the SNAP program is, the food stamp program. They're not going to cut big ag stuff. Come on, they're the ones that give them campaign money. They're not going to do that. They're going to cut family farms. They're going to cut the SNAP program, for the poor people and the rest of us. Big ag gets they're going to get a chunk of that tax cut I mentioned before. Well, what's going to happen to the ag markets when there's less being, used by the government to, make stuff for the SNAP benefits? Family farms are already struggling. Where are they going to, get more money when this happens? Let's not forget the damage that the closing the USAID agency has already done to the agricultural markets. I mean, the government was buying a bunch of your food, that you grow, and sending it around the world to feed starving people. Well, that's gone now. That part of the market's gone. There's going to be less demand for ag products now. You're not going to be able to sell it. Or if you do, it's going to be cheaper price stuff. Let's not forget the damage the tariffs are doing to the ag markets. I mentioned before how China has just signed a big trade deal with Brazil rather than the United States because of these tariffs. During Trump's first term, thanks to the socialist subsidies, farmers got some money, to help them get through that because with the tariffs Trump put on at that time, the ag markets went to crap. Well, it's probably going to go further crap now, if that's such a thing. Do you think Trump's going to do a subsidy for you again? I doubt it. Family farmers who are struggling, they're going to go like, well, it's time for us to sell. We can't afford this anymore. Who's going to swoop in and buy them? Big ag and investment firms, of course. So why do you keep voting for Republicans? Are you still willing to lose your farm, lose a bunch of money, just to own the libs? Right, what about education? They're going to cut $330 billion from education. Guess where that's going to hurt the most? Rural schools. You're going to have rural schools closing. You're going to have less teachers. You're going to have larger class size. You're going to have crappier buildings. How are you going to pay for that? Unless you get referendums to pass raising your own taxes. I don't think that's going to happen in rural areas. What are you going to do? You're going to blame Democrats because your taxes go up just so you can keep your schools and keep your hospitals? Well, when your hospitals close, when your schools close, don't be blaming the Democrats. You got to look your kid in the eye and tell them why your school is shutting down, why you're going to have to sell your house, why you got less food. Good luck with that. So we'll see you next week. We'll talk more about this bill, I'm sure.